the pyramid tombs, and the Valley of the Kings, the final resting places of powerful pharaohs. Of the possible 63 tombs in the valley, there is one that outshines the rest and has captured the world's imagination.
A pharaoh was buried 3,500 years ago. His tomb was then emptied, his body was broken, and the entrance was buried so deeply that nobody found it for over a century. In 2022, when archaeologists finally crawled inside, what they discovered shook the entire field of Egyptology.
For the first time in more than a century, a new royal Egyptian tomb has been discovered. Egyptian officials announced Tuesday the discovery of the tomb of King Thutmose II.
This was not a tomb that had been robbed. It was a tomb that had been used as a weapon, and the person who wielded it was someone the king trusted completely. The discovery. For decades, a small label on old archaeological maps marked a site in the Egyptian desert with just 2 characters. C4, no description, no excavation record, no follow-up. Just a forgotten notation in a remote valley roughly 2.5 kilometers west of the Valley of the Kings, the famous burial ground of Egypt's most powerful rulers. Generation after generation of archaeologists saw that label and moved on. That assumption protected one of the most disturbing tombs in Egyptian history for over a century. In October 2022, a joint Egyptian and British team led by Dr. Piers Litherland finally decided C4 deserved a serious look. What followed was not a clean or exciting excavation. It was months of grinding, exhausting work in brutal desert heat, removing tons of debris and compacted rock layer by layer with hand tools. The team worked without knowing whether anything was even there. Then, after all of that, they found the entrance. It was 40 centimeters wide, roughly the width of a household letterbox. A fully grown adult had to strip off their equipment and push through head first, on their stomach, through 10 meters of complete darkness. The workers who originally carved this passage 3,500 years ago worked by the flame of small oil lamps in an enclosed rock tunnel where oxygen ran thin fast. Archaeologists working other New Kingdom tomb sites have found evidence of workers who lost consciousness and died in passages built exactly this way. The men who carved C4 may have died inside it. Not one of their names was ever recorded. When the team finally stood upright inside the tomb, they came face to face with something that made no sense. The floor of the entrance corridor sat 1.4 meters higher than the floor of the burial chamber below. Picture a corridor that suddenly ends at a chest-high ledge, and on the other side of that ledge the ground drops straight down. No slope, no steps, just a sheer vertical drop carved cleanly into the rock, sitting right at the entrance to the space where a king was supposed to rest for eternity. A royal sarcophagus from this period weighed several tons. Lowering that over a chest-high drop with no ramp and no support structure was not just difficult, it was impossible. Below the drop, the burial chamber was packed with hardened sediment. The tomb sat directly beneath 2 natural waterfalls in the cliff above. Every rainfall for 3,500 years sent floodwater crashing through that entrance and over the ledge. The sediment it left behind had compressed until it was nearly as hard as concrete. The team spent months removing it by hand before they could see the floor. The chisel marks around that vertical drop showed no corrections and no signs of a change in plan. They were clean and deliberate. This was not a building mistake that was never fixed. It was carved exactly as intended. Then, buried in the hardened sediment, the team found fragments of ancient plaster jars. On those fragments were royal titles belonging to Thutmose II, a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty lost to history for 3,500 years. The first funerary objects ever found belonging to this king. That discovery should have felt like a triumph. Instead, it opened a question that would get darker with every answer they found. But before we go any further, you need to understand who Thutmose II actually was. Because nothing about C4 makes sense until you know the man whose name was on those broken jars. And his story is darker than anything carved into these walls. the man in the tomb. Historians have studied ancient Egypt for centuries. They have reconstructed the reigns of dozens of pharaohs in extraordinary detail. And yet, when it comes to Thutmose II, they cannot agree on something as basic as how long he ruled. Some scholars say 3 years, some say 13. After 3,500 years of research, that gap has never been closed. A king so politically minor that the ancient world barely noticed him, and the modern world cannot fully reconstruct him. Thutmose II came to the throne not through strength or achievement, but through birth order and luck. His father, Thutmose I, was a military conqueror who pushed Egypt's borders further than almost any ruler before him. His own son, the future Thutmose III, would grow up to become one of the most feared military commanders the ancient world ever produced. Thutmose II sat between these two giants and was neither. He was the quiet, forgettable reign sandwiched between two extraordinary ones. His own body told the story his records would not. When forensic scientists examined his mummy, they found evidence of a serious disease that had affected his skin and likely damaged his internal organs. He was probably physically weakened for much of his time on the throne. In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh's authority rested on the image of physical strength and divine power. A visibly sick king was a king whose grip on power depended entirely on the loyalty of the people immediately around him. Those people had plans of their own. He was married to Hatshepsut, his half-sister, as Egyptian royal practice required. By almost every account preserved from this period, she was more capable, more politically sharp, and more ambitious than her husband. Court records from his own reign show her accumulating religious titles and administrative authority while Thutmose II was still alive. She was not waiting for him to die. She was preparing her position before he did. When Thutmose II died, Hatshepsut stepped in as regent for his infant heir, a young boy who would become Thutmose III. She held that role for approximately 2 years. Then she declared herself Pharaoh, not regent, not advisor, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. What followed was extraordinary in its coldness. She commissioned artists across the country to depict her with a male body, a ceremonial false beard, and the full masculine titles of a reigning king. At a grand temple at Deir el-Bahari, she had a full divine birth story carved into the walls, depicting the god Amun disguising himself as Thutmose I in order to father her. She was not just claiming the throne. She was rewriting religious history to make herself more divinely legitimate than her dead husband had ever been. She did not erase his name. She needed it. His name was the legal thread that connected her reign to legitimate royal succession. She kept it everywhere it served her purpose. In death, he became more useful to her than he had ever been while alive. This was the man buried in C4, not a warrior, not a celebrated ruler, a physically weakened, politically outmaneuvered king whose death became the opening move in one of the most calculated power seizures in Egyptian history. And the tomb built in his name was the first weapon used against him. The tomb that makes no sense, built wrong on purpose. Egyptian architects of the 18th dynasty were not careless men. They studied water flow and cliff drainage for generations. They understood how desert geography behaved across decades and seasons. When they chose a location for a royal tomb, that choice was deliberate and precise down to the last detail. Placing a king's tomb directly beneath 2 converging natural waterfalls in a cliff was not an oversight. It was a calculated decision, because a tomb built beneath waterfalls will flood. It will flood repeatedly, severely, and on a completely predictable schedule. And a flooded tomb, sooner or later, needs to be opened again. The architect behind C4 was a man named Inanni, the chief royal architect who had served 4 consecutive pharaohs and was the most experienced tomb builder in Egypt. In his own burial text, Inanni left behind one line that has unsettled researchers for generations. He wrote that he dug the tomb of a previous king alone, with no one seeing and no one hearing. Scholars have never agreed on what the word alone means in that sentence. One interpretation that has never been dismissed is this: The workers who built royal tombs were killed after the work was finished because dead men cannot reveal secret locations. There is no record of what happened to the workers who built C4. Their names and work logs vanish from every document at a certain point, as if they were simply removed from the record. The physical design of C4 continued this pattern of deliberate impossibility at every level. The entrance at 40 centimeters wide made it impossible to move standard royal burial equipment through it. The large wooden shrines, ceremonial furniture, and canopic chests that accompanied every royal burial of this era were all far too large for that opening. This was known before the first stone was cut. The architect knew it and built the entrance anyway. Then came the vertical drop. 1.4 meters of sheer stone at the end of the corridor, sitting directly above the burial chamber floor. Moving a royal sarcophagus weighing several tons over that drop, with no ramp and no support structure, in a space lit only by oil lamps, would have been catastrophic. It would have destroyed the coffin, likely destroyed the mummy inside it, and could have brought the surrounding stone down on the workers attempting it. A functional burial was never possible inside this tomb. The design guaranteed that from the beginning. The wall paintings made everything colder still. The fragments recovered from inside depicted sections of an ancient religious text called the Amduat. This text describes the sun god Ra traveling through 12 hours of the underworld before being reborn at dawn. It was commonly used in royal tombs as a source of spiritual protection for the dead king. But the specific hours chosen for C4 were hours 7 through 12, the darkest passage in the entire text. Hour 7 describes the condemned enemies of Ra being decapitated, dismembered, and burned in lakes of fire by divine executioners. This is the most violent, most punishing imagery in the entire Egyptian religious tradition. It was painted inside a tomb that was architecturally built to be impossible to use for its stated purpose. That was not a decoration choice. That was a message. And the message was aimed at anyone who might consider interfering with whatever this place was truly built to do. It was only when one member of the team stopped looking down from the corridor and walked into the chamber below to look up that the real purpose of C4 finally revealed itself. The loading dock, a tomb engineered for removal. One archaeologist stepped down into the lower burial chamber and turned around. He looked up at the 1.4-meter wall from below, and the entire investigation changed direction. From the corridor above, that wall had looked like an obstacle, an inexplicable barrier with no rational purpose. But from the chamber below, it looked completely different. At chest height, it sat at the exact right elevation for a team of people standing on the lower floor to lift heavy objects up and push them onto the corridor above. No ladders, no ropes, no complex equipment, just human hands and the right height, like the edge of a swimming pool where a person treading water can plant their hands and push themselves up and out. The conclusion that followed was quiet and devastating. C4 was not built to keep anything in. It was built to move everything out, quickly, efficiently, and under pressure. It was not a tomb, it was a removal station. The physical state of the tomb confirmed this at every point. The burial chamber was completely empty, but it had none of the signs of ancient tomb robbery. When robbers broke into royal tombs, they left chaos behind. Smashed stone lids, scattered pottery, ash from their torches on the walls, biological traces, sometimes graffiti scratched into the stone. C4 had none of this. The only items recovered were tiny plaster jar fragments caught in rock crevices beneath layers of flood sediment. Everything else had been removed in a way that was organized, deliberate, and total. The people who emptied this tomb were not criminals. They were officials acting under direct orders from the highest authority in Egypt. There is an important difference between a robbed tomb and an officially cleared one. A robbery is a crime committed in secret by people with no authority. An official clearance is a command carried out openly by people with full state power behind them. C4 shows every sign of a command. Among the plaster fragments recovered from the sediment, The team found something that should not have been there at all. Beside the royal titles of Thutmose II, the jar inscriptions carried blessings for the living Queen Hatshepsut, wishing her long life. A dead king's burial equipment inscribed with prayers for his living wife. That was not established practice. That was not tradition or accident. Inserting a living queen's name into a dead king's burial ritual was a statement of control. Hatshepsut was not present in this tomb as a mourner. She was present as the person running the operation. The Amduat paintings on the walls now carried a second meaning alongside the first. Hours 7 through 12 describe transformation and release, the movement through destruction toward rebirth. Hour 7, with its imagery of divine execution, was painted inside a tomb built to be emptied on schedule. Whoever chose those specific hours was not offering the dead king spiritual comfort. They were warning anyone watching that interfering with this process carried divine consequences. The team's conclusion overturned more than a century of assumptions about how Egyptian royal burials worked. C4 had not failed. It had worked exactly as designed. The emptiness was not a tragedy left behind by disaster. It was the proof that the system had completed its purpose 3,500 years before anyone crawled through its entrance. But what actually happened to the king after he was lifted over that wall? The answer was not found in the tomb. It was found on his body. And the people who first found that body in 1881 had no explanation for what they saw. The discovery of C4 just provided one: the broken king. In 1881, a team of French archaeologists opened a hidden chamber at a site called Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor. Inside, they found 50 royal mummies, 50 kings and queens of ancient Egypt, gathered and hidden there by priests centuries earlier, when tomb robbery across the Valley of the Kings had spiraled completely out of control. The priests had worked fast and without ceremony. They stripped most of the kings from their original coffins, re-wrapped them in plain white linen, and stacked them together in the chamber like stored goods. Thutmose II was among them. He had been placed in a second-hand coffin that belonged to someone else entirely. One of Egypt's ruling pharaohs ended his eternity misidentified, damaged, and stored in another man's box. When the team examined the mummy, what they found was immediately disturbing. His left arm was broken at the shoulder joint. His forearm was detached cleanly at the elbow. His right arm was severed below the elbow. For over 100 years, Egyptologists placed the blame on ancient tomb robbers. The discovery of C4 took that explanation apart completely. Robbers cause random damage. They smash and tear without pattern because they are searching for valuables under pressure and in darkness. The damage on the body of Thutmose II is not random. It follows a specific mechanical pattern. The shoulder break is the injury that happens when a body is being pulled upward from above while its full dead weight is still pulling downward. The elbow detachment is what happens when the wrappings of a mummy catch on a hard stone edge while the rest of the body is still being dragged forward. The forearm severance is consistent with a wrapped, rigid body being hauled horizontally across a sharp stone ledge in a confined space. These injuries match one specific event: being dragged over a chest-high stone wall in the dark while floodwater rises on the floor below. His own priests did this to him. Standing in the lower chamber of C4 with water climbing around their feet, following orders from above, they lifted his coffin to the height of the ledge and pulled him over the corridor edge. His arms broke in the process. The operation could not stop for that. There was no time. The flood was not waiting. Sit with that for a moment. This was a man his entire civilization considered divine. The living representative of the god Horus on earth. Dragged over a stone wall in the dark, his body breaking under the hands of the priests appointed to honor him because someone with authority had decided that speed mattered more than reverence, and that someone had written her name on the jars left behind in his burial chamber. Hatshepsut had chosen the flood-guaranteed location. Hatshepsut had overseen the construction of the wall built for removal. Her name appeared on his burial equipment while he was still being processed for the afterlife, and within a few years of this evacuation, she was standing before the court of Egypt in a ceremonial beard, holding the crook and flail of a ruling pharaoh, with her divine origin story carved in stone on the walls of her own temple. The broken arms of Thutmose II are not a footnote in that story. They are its first piece of physical evidence. The coup did not begin when she put on the crown. It began the night his body was hauled over that wall. One more thing. Thutmose III, the son who spent years chiseling Hatshepsut's face off monuments all across Egypt, never came back to C4, never restored it, never resealed it or gave his father a proper burial. A man who erased his stepmother from the walls of an entire civilization chose to leave his own father's violated tomb completely alone. That silence has never been explained. But Hatshepsut was not finished with C4 even after the king was gone. She came back, and what she ordered next was the coldest and most calculated act in this entire story. Burying the evidence, the 23 meters of silence. After the king was removed from C4 and transferred to wherever he was taken, someone gave one final order concerning the tomb. Bury it, not seal it, not close the entrance with stone and plaster the way Egyptian priests normally closed a royal tomb. Bury it so completely that it would vanish from the surface of the earth and leave no evidence it had ever existed. Hundreds of workers were brought to that remote valley. The operation left no official record of any kind, no roster of the workers involved, no inventory of the materials used, no daily work log, no administrative document of any description. These workers spent multiple seasons packing earth, rock, and rubble over the entrance to C4 until 23 meters of compacted fill sat above that 40-centimeter doorway. 23 meters is the height of an 8-story building, pressed down over a single entrance. Standard tomb sealing in ancient Egypt involved blocking the doorway with stone and coating the seal with plaster. That was considered sufficient. What was done to C4 went far beyond that. This was not sealing. This was erasure. Someone with enormous authority and access to large numbers of workers needed this site to completely disappear, and they made it happen without leaving a single written trace of the operation. That absence of documentation is itself one of the most disturbing details in this entire story. Egypt's royal administration kept records of almost everything. The workers who built royal tombs, a community of craftsmen housed in a walled village called Deir el-Medina, kept detailed daily logs across generations. They recorded work assignments, ration collections, injuries, arguments, and absences. For the burial of C4, nothing from this community survives. Not one line. The workers who carried out the burial also disappeared from the record. No discharge documents, no final payment records, no mention of this workforce anywhere in the surviving administrative texts from this period. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were confined to their walled village their entire working lives, specifically because they knew the locations of royal tombs. What happened to the men who knew where C4 was and what it had contained is not recorded anywhere. Ineni, the architect, left one line in his own burial text about building works that no one saw and no one heard about. At the time scholars first read it, that line seemed like professional modesty. Now it reads like the only record he was able to safely leave. He could not document the burial of C4 in any official capacity because that operation did not officially exist. So he placed one sentence in his own tomb, addressed to eternity, and said nothing more. The only person in Egypt with the authority to organize this scale of operation in total secrecy was the ruling pharaoh. At the time this burial was most likely carried out, that pharaoh was Hatshepsut. After her death, Thutmose III dismantled her legacy with systematic fury. Her name was removed from walls across the country. Her statues were broken and buried in pits. Her obelisks were enclosed in stone casing so her inscriptions could not be read. The erasure was so thorough that modern Egyptologists did not fully understand who she was until the 20th century. But she never touched the name of Thutmose II. She left it intact wherever it served her. His name gave her reign its legal foundation. She took everything from him and kept only his name because his name was worth more to her than anything else he had left behind. C4 sat buried and silent under 23 meters of fill from the moment that operation ended until 2022, and what all of that fill was protecting was not a treasure. It was a direction, a path pointing toward somewhere that has never been found. The tomb that is still out there. C4 was never the final stop. It was a transfer point. The flood-guaranteed location, the entrance too narrow for any royal burial equipment, the wall built to exactly the right height for lifting objects out, the complete and orderly removal of everything inside. Every detail points to the same conclusion. The king and everything buried with him were taken somewhere else after that night. A second tomb, the real tomb, the actual destination. And it has not been found. It is out there right now, beneath the Theban cliffs, untouched. The Theban Mapping Project has been scanning the cliffs and valleys surrounding the Valley of the Kings using ground-penetrating radar, a technology that sends signals into the earth and detects hollow spaces beneath the surface that should not naturally be there. The project has identified several underground anomalies in locations that have never been excavated. At least one sits in a position geographically consistent with a transfer route leading directly out of C4. It has not been confirmed as the final resting place of Thutmose II, but it has not been ruled out either. Whatever it is sitting in complete darkness beneath the desert floor and no one has opened it. If that tomb is found intact, it would contain the only complete royal burial collection ever recovered from the reign of Thutmose II. Not a single object definitively belonging to this king exists in any museum collection in the world today. The jar fragments from C4 are the first funerary items ever identified as his. Everything else, his sarcophagus, his grave goods, his ceremonial objects, the full material record of his life and reign, would be in there, waiting. But here is where this story turns completely cold. Every object inside that tomb was packed and moved by Hatshepsut's people. Her priests lifted his coffin over the wall. Her officials organized the transfer through the dark. Her administration decided what went with him and what did not. What is waiting in that second tomb is not Thutmose II's vision of his own eternity. It is Hatshepsut's edited version of him, assembled on the night she had him removed from the tomb she had built to fail. Opening that tomb would not mean meeting the king. It would mean meeting his wife's portrait of him, built in secret, by people following orders that were never written down. What emerged from Chamber C4 was not gold. It was evidence. A wall built to the exact height needed for moving bodies out. A king's arms broken in the dark. 23 meters of fill pressed over an entrance to silence everything that happened inside. One architect, one authority. No surviving record. And somewhere beneath the desert, a door that has not been opened in 3,500 years.